Story 1, The Man in Apartment 3B. I moved into my new apartment complex during the fall, just before Halloween. It was a quiet place, at least that's what the landlord promised. But from the very first night, I noticed something strange about the man in apartment 3B. He was always awake. No matter what hour I passed by his door, midnight, 2 a.m., even 4 in the morning, his light was on. Once, I heard faint whispers through the walls, like someone muttering a prayer backwards. A week later, I came home to find my front door slightly open. Nothing seemed stolen, except for a single photo from a box I hadn't unpacked yet, an old childhood picture. That night, I woke up to a scratching sound at my door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw the man from 3B standing there, grinning, holding that same photo. I called the police, but when they arrived, apartment 3B was empty. He had moved out, no forwarding address, no record of his lease. The landlord swore no one named Evan had ever lived there. Story 2, The Backyard Window. Sarah and her husband had just bought their dream home, a quiet suburban house with a big backyard. Their next-door neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Hadley, seemed friendly enough at first. But soon, Sarah began noticing her in the backyard late at night, just standing there and staring into their windows. When Sarah confronted her, Mrs. Hadley smiled and said, "I used to watch a family just like yours. They disappeared one night, and I've been waiting for them to come back." Disturbed, Sarah and her husband installed cameras. One night, they reviewed the footage and saw Mrs. Hadley standing by their daughter's window just watching, smiling. The next day, she was gone. Police found her house abandoned, but inside were dozens of photographs of Sarah, her husband, and their daughter taken from outside their home. Story 3, The Basement Tenant. A college student named Ryan rented a small basement room in a suburban neighborhood. His landlord, a middle-aged man named Paul, lived upstairs. Paul was friendly but strange. He often asked Ryan odd questions. "Do you hear it too, or do you ever feel like the house is breathing?" One night, Ryan woke up to footsteps above him, heavy, slow, pacing back and forth. Then came a voice whispering through the air vent, "He knows you're down there." Ryan ran upstairs, but Paul's bedroom door was open and empty. Police later discovered a hidden crawl space beneath the floorboards, filled with recordings of Ryan sleeping. The voice he heard that night wasn't Paul's. It was his own, played back from one of those tapes. One of the most chilling aspects of these true neighbor horror stories is how they dismantle the comforting illusion of safety we associate with home. Our homes are supposed to be sanctuaries, places where we lock the doors, close the curtains, and finally breathe without fear. We tell ourselves that the outside world holds the danger, not the house next door, not the man in the apartment across the hall. But when terror comes from those very walls, when the threat is living just a few steps away, that illusion collapses, and with it, our sense of peace. Each story exposes the fragility of that supposed safety. In The Man in Apartment 3B, the narrator thought she was surrounded by ordinary neighbors, only to discover one was silently invading her personal space. In The Backyard Window, a family's dream home turned into a nightmare simply because someone nearby decided to make them their nightly entertainment. These aren't haunted houses or cursed lands, they're normal, everyday homes. That's what makes them so disturbing. The horror doesn't come from supernatural forces, but from the unsettling realization that evil can live beside you, unnoticed. A neighbor's smile, a friendly wave, or a casual greeting suddenly takes on new meaning when you realize what may be lurking behind it. The man who always seems awake. The woman who always watches. The landlord who always checks in. These familiar presences twist into something sinister once you see the truth that the danger was never out there. It was next door. Psychologically, this kind of fear cuts deeper than any monster or ghost story ever could. It erodes the boundaries that define comfort and safety. You can't move away from every neighbor, can't live without community, can't stop existing beside others. That inevitability makes the fear universal. Anyone, anywhere, could experience it. Ultimately, these stories remind us of a terrifying truth: security is a fragile illusion built on trust. And when that trust is broken, the ordinary becomes terrifying. The laughter of a neighbor becomes a threat. The sound of footsteps outside turns into a warning. Home ceases to be a refuge, it becomes a cage, and the thing you fear most isn't trying to get in, it's already there. Behind every one of these neighbor horror stories lies a disturbingly human truth: the darkness of obsession. Unlike ghosts or monsters, this evil isn't born of fantasy, it grows quietly within ordinary people, hidden beneath polite smiles and casual hellos. The psychology of obsession and voyeurism is what makes these encounters truly horrifying, because it reveals how far curiosity can go when empathy disappears. The neighbors in these stories don't simply observe, they study, watch, and collect. In The Man in Apartment 3B, the neighbor's fascination evolves into an unhealthy fixation. He crosses invisible lines, turning private moments into possessions. In The Backyard Window, Mrs. Hadley's nightly presence outside the window isn't just creepy, it's symbolic of control. She doesn't need to harm physically, her power lies in the act of watching, of making her victims feel constantly exposed. And in The Basement Tenant, the landlord records his tenant's life without consent, using his curiosity as justification for intrusion. These acts of voyeurism aren't random, they're deliberate invasions meant to strip others of privacy, identity, and peace. Psychologically, voyeurism is rooted in dominance. Watching without being seen grants the voyeur a twisted sense of power, a belief that they know something others don't. It's the illusion of control, the idea that through observation, one becomes superior. This desire often masks deep insecurity or loneliness, but once obsession takes hold, empathy fades completely. What begins as fascination becomes possession. The watcher no longer sees a person, only an object to study, record, or keep. That's what makes this form of horror so chilling. It's slow, invasive, and deeply personal. There's no sudden attack, no loud moment of terror. Instead, the fear seeps in gradually. You start noticing small things: a misplaced object, a lingering stare, a light on late at night, until the realization hits: someone has been watching you all along. These stories show us how fragile privacy really is, and how dangerous human obsession can become when left unchecked. The neighbors didn't need supernatural powers to be monsters, their gaze was enough. Because sometimes, the scariest thing in the world isn't being alone, it's realizing you never were. Paranoia is one of the most insidious forms of fear, not because it's always unfounded, but because it often starts with something real. A sound in the hallway, a flicker in the window, a shadow that seems to move when you're not looking. In these stories, paranoia isn't just a reaction to danger, it is the danger. The feeling that you're being watched, that unseen eyes follow your every move, slowly consumes your peace until you can no longer tell what's real. Each of the three stories demonstrates how paranoia festers in the mind when safety is violated by something familiar. In The Man in Apartment 3B, the main character's sleepless nights and growing anxiety blur the line between imagination and reality. The man's constant presence, the whispering, the missing photo, all of it builds an environment where fear becomes the only truth. Similarly, in The Backyard Window, Sarah's growing suspicion turns her home into a prison. She can't enjoy a quiet evening or open the blinds without feeling those invisible eyes staring back at her. And in the basement tenant, Ryan's late-night footsteps and mysterious whispers trap him in a cycle of doubt. Is someone there, or is he losing his mind? That's the power of paranoia. It transforms ordinary life into a nightmare. A creak in the floor isn't just the house settling, it's someone waiting. A shadow outside the window isn't the wind, it's the neighbor, watching again. Once the seed of fear is planted, it spreads quickly, twisting every sound, every silence, every glance into evidence of threat. Psychologically, paranoia thrives in isolation. When victims realize they can't trust those around them, especially their neighbors, they begin to distrust themselves too. Every instinct becomes a question. Every decision feels dangerous. The home, once a sanctuary, becomes a cage built from uncertainty. These stories remind us that horror doesn't always come in the form of blood or violence. Sometimes, it's the quiet dread of living under invisible surveillance, the slow erosion of trust in your own surroundings. Because when paranoia takes root, there's no monster to fight, only the haunting realization that danger may be real, and that you might never prove it until it's too late. Curiosity is a natural part of human nature. We all look, wonder, and observe the world, our neighbors, the sounds outside, the lives happening just beyond our walls. But in these stories, curiosity slips into something darker. What begins as harmless interest transforms into obsession, and that obsession soon festers into malevolence. The line between looking and stalking, between wondering and violating, is thin, and once it's crossed, the consequences become terrifying. In The Man in Apartment 3B, the neighbor's curiosity about the new tenant starts innocently enough: glances, small talk, perhaps simple fascination. But it grows into a fixation that devours empathy. By the time he begins entering her home and taking her photos, his curiosity has evolved into possession. In The Backyard Window, Mrs. Hadley's lonely intrigue turns sinister as she watches the family every night, claiming she's waiting for them to come back. Her curiosity about their lives becomes a disturbing need to control them. And in The Basement Tenant, the landlord's interest in his tenant's habits devolves into voyeurism and manipulation. His desire to understand crosses a moral threshold that can't be undone. This progression from curiosity to obsession to evil is what makes human horror so frightening. It doesn't happen instantly, it creeps forward step by step, disguised as concern, fascination, or friendliness. People rarely notice when they're crossing that invisible boundary. They tell themselves they're just interested or worried. But interest without restraint becomes intrusion, and once someone feels entitled to another person's privacy, darkness takes over. What makes this form of horror especially unsettling is its realism. We all have moments of curiosity: peeking through a window, scrolling through someone's life online, wondering about the people who live next door. But these stories warn us what happens when curiosity loses its humanity. When the act of watching replaces empathy, and fascination replaces respect, curiosity becomes a weapon. In the end, these stories remind us that monsters aren't always born from nightmares. Sometimes, they're created from very human impulses: curiosity, loneliness, fascination twisted beyond recognition. Evil doesn't always arrive with violence or rage. Sometimes, it begins with a simple look through a window, that lasts just a little too long. So the next time you wave at your neighbor, or hear footsteps in the hallway at night, think twice. The walls that separate our lives are thinner than we imagine. Behind every drawn curtain, behind every polite smile, there might be someone watching, someone whose curiosity has already crossed that invisible line. We never really know the people who live beside us, we just share a border, a fragile illusion of safety. And sometimes, that's all it takes for horror to find its way in, not through a broken door or a shattered window, but through the eyes of the person next door.